Montana Territory, June 1883, the first time Cooper Valen laid eyes on her. She was sitting alone on the edge of a burned-out homestead, staring at nothing like she had already given up on the world. He had seen a lot on the trail, broken wagons, broken men, but there was something about the way she held herself that stopped him cold. Not slumped or hunched, straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, as if waiting for someone who was never going to come. He slowed his horse and took in the scene. The house was half gutted by fire. The barn, too. A child's shoe lay abandoned on the porch steps. There were no livestock sounds, no chicken scratching. Just wind and ashes and a woman who looked like she had survived the end of the world. She did not look up when he dismounted. "You all right, miss?" Cooper asked, voice low. She blinked once. No, that was all. He stepped closer, booted feet crunching on blackened grass. "Is there anyone I can send for?" "Family. They're dead," she said. He nodded once, hat in hand. "Your name?" "Nella Whitlow." He waited. She said nothing more. "I'm Cooper Valen. I was headed south, but I can help you bury them, if you want." She looked at him, then really looked. Her eyes were raw with grief, but there was something else under it. Something like suspicion. Like she had been promised help before, and it had gone badly. "My husband's buried already," she said. "I did it the night the fire stopped." "And the rest?" She glanced toward the barn. "My son, Walker. He's gone. I could not find him in the smoke. He was 5. Cooper swore softly, then looked away, jaw tight. "I spent 2 days looking," she said, voice flat. The wind picked up. "I thought maybe he wandered off. Maybe he's still. I do not know. I do not know anything anymore." He nodded again, slow. "Do you mind if I help search?" Nella blinked fast. "Why would you do that?" "Because you look like hell," he said, honest. "And no one should have to go through this alone." She did not argue. They searched for 3 hours across the ridgeline and the creek bed. Cooper's horse, Flint, moved steady while Nella walked with a limp she tried to hide. Her dress was torn at one shoulder, and her hands were blistered. "I lost my daughter, too," Cooper said quietly, as they reached a line of cottonwoods. Winter of '81. Fever took her quick. Nella's head turned toward him. "I know it does not fix anything," he said. "But I know what it feels like to lose more than you can carry." Nella did not speak, but she walked closer beside him after that. They found the boy near dusk, curled beneath a cedar tree, his tiny frame pale and still but breathing. Nella collapsed at his side, hands shaking as she touched his face. "Walker," she whispered. "Oh God, Walker." The boy stirred, coughed. "Mama." Cooper knelt and checked his pulse. "He's warm. Weak. But he is alive." Nella cradled him, rocking slightly. Her tears ran silent, soaking into the boy's soot-streaked hair. "Thank you," she said hoarsely. Cooper stood back and gave her space, but his chest ached watching the way she held her son, like she could not believe he was real. They stayed that night in the remains of the root cellar, the only part of the homestead still standing. Cooper built a fire just outside the door and boiled water for tea. Walker slept, his head in Nella's lap. She stroked his hair slowly. "I had another child," she said at last. "Willa. She was 2. She died in the fire." Cooper's throat tightened. "I am sorry." Nella nodded, hollow. "Everyone says that. I mean it." She looked at him then, her face lit faintly by the firelight. "They all said I was broken, that I would never come back from this." Cooper stared into the flames. "Well, they were wrong. You do not know me." "I know enough," he said. "You buried your husband. You kept looking for your boy when most would have given up. You are not broken, Nella. You are just getting started." She stared at him like he had slapped her. Then her eyes filled, quiet and full. "Why are you being kind to me?" "Because I see you," he said softly. "All of you. And I know what it means to survive." The next morning, Cooper saddled Flint and secured their few belongings. Nella stood with Walker on her hip, her face drawn but clearer somehow. "I do not know where to go," she admitted. "Come with me," Cooper said. "I have a place outside Red Lodge. It is not much, but it is safe." Nella's mouth parted. "You would take us in?" "You and Walker belong somewhere you can heal," he said. "I can help, if you will let me." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "All right." Cooper reached down. She took his hand. Walker blinked up at him, still groggy, still clinging to his mother's dress. They rode out together, the sun rising behind them, casting long shadows across the blackened land they left behind. They reached Red Lodge 3 days later, just after a rain that darkened the road and made the cottonwoods gleam. The wagon they'd shared with an old trapper the final day was slow, but it spared Walker the jostle of a horse, and Nella's limp had worsened. Cooper paid the man in coin and jerky, then helped Nella down, careful of her arm where the bruises hadn't yet faded. "This way," he said, adjusting the saddlebag over his shoulder. "It's up past the mill, near Pine Creek." The town was modest: two dusty streets, a smithy, a mercantile, a saloon that leaned slightly to one side. Cooper didn't pause. He led them through without drawing attention, though a few women in aprons watched Nella with narrowed eyes. She kept her chin level, but her fingers tightened around Walker's small hand. Once they turned off the main road, the land opened. Cooper's cabin came into view beyond a split-rail fence, nestled low beneath a ridge where deer sometimes stood at dusk. "It's small," he said, unlocking the door with a key kept on a nail behind a beam. "But it's clean, and it's yours as long as you want it." Nella stepped inside, eyes scanning the single-room wood stove near the corner, table with 2 chairs, bed against the wall. A woven rug lay near the hearth, its pattern faded but intact. There was a worn rocking chair, and beside it, a wooden cradle, empty. She touched the edge of it, then let her hand fall. "Where will you sleep?" she asked. "I've got a cot in the shed. It's dry, and the roof don't leak." Nella looked toward the window, where the rain had left streaks on the glass. "You didn't build this for yourself." "No," Cooper said. "I didn't." She didn't press. Walker climbed into the bed without being told and fell asleep curled around a pillow that still smelled faintly of cedar. "I'll bring supper from the smokehouse," Cooper said. "There's trout and beans, and I've got a little cornmeal left." "I can cook," Nella offered, but quietly. "You can rest," he replied. "Just for tonight." She folded her hands, then nodded once. By the time the sky turned the color of iron, the cabin smelled of firewood and salt. They ate in silence, the kind that didn't strain. When she finished, Nella gathered the plates without comment. Cooper watched her move, noticing how she kept her weight off her right leg more now, how her shoulders had dropped just a little from the tight line they'd held since the first day. "I can fix that limp," he said finally, "if you'll let me." "I've seen doctors," she said, not looking up. "I'm not a doctor." She hesitated. "There's poultice root up by the ridge," he continued. "Boiled long enough, it can pull heat from bone. I've used it on horses, and I've used it on myself." "I don't want to owe you," she said. "You won't." She set the plate down, hands still. "I don't think I know how to live without expecting the worst," she said. "You don't have to know yet," he said. "You just have to stay long enough to find out." Outside, the wind picked up and brushed against the shutters. Nella crossed to the cradle and pulled a blanket over Walker's sleeping form, then sat in the rocker and stared into the dark. Cooper didn't speak again. He watched her from the door, then stepped out into the night. In the shed, he rolled out the cot and lit his lantern low. Rain tapped against the roof, and the air smelled of damp pine. He looked toward the cabin once before blowing out the flame. In the morning, he'd ride out for the root. And maybe, if she let him, he'd teach her how to heal. The poultice helped. It took 3 days, a half-dozen boiled cloths, and Cooper lifting Nella's leg each evening with the patient steadiness of a man who had done his share of quiet tending. She never flinched, but her jaw stayed tight until he wrapped her knee and set her foot back down again. On the 4th morning, she walked to the edge of the garden plot without leaning on the doorframe. Cooper, bent over a row of dry stalks, glanced up. "That's better." "I didn't say it didn't hurt," she replied, brushing hair back from her face. "But it doesn't stop me." He stood, brushing dirt from his palms. "I've got seeds. Turnips, mostly. Some beans." She looked at the soil, cracked and pale. "It'll take work if we want anything to grow." Her gaze met his, level. "If I'm here, I'm not going to sit idle." Cooper nodded. "Fair enough." By the time the sun reached its highest point, she'd cleared the weeds from 2 rows. Her hands were blistered again, but she didn't complain. Walker sat under the cottonwood with a wooden horse Cooper had carved years earlier, humming tunelessly and patting the toy's head. Nella glanced over at him. "He hasn't spoken much since the fire." "He will," Cooper said, "in his own time." She wiped her brow with her sleeve. "I keep wondering if I'll ever understand what he lost. If I lost the same or worse." "You lost different," Cooper said, "but you're both still here." That afternoon, She sat on the porch with her mending in her lap, pulling thread through a worn cuff of Cooper's shirt. The silence between them had softened. It wasn't the silence of two strangers anymore. It felt like the kind that came when words took second place to presence. He leaned on the porch rail, watching the sky shift. "You ever sew for trade?" "Some," she said, tying off a stitch. "But mostly for need." Cooper nodded. "There's a widow near the Grange who sells cloth. I could mention you." "I'm not ready to be looked at," she said, not unkindly. He didn't press. That night, Walker woke crying. Not loud, just a small, broken sound like he wasn't sure what world he was in. Nella was up in an instant, lifting him into her arms and whispering something Cooper couldn't hear. From the shed, Cooper watched the dim light flicker through the cabin window until it went still again. The next morning, Nella stood at the stove, stirring something over the fire. Cooper stepped inside, pulling off his gloves. "You didn't have to," she held up a hand. "It was time I cooked again." He took a seat, watching the way she moved. Not fast, not fully at ease, but measured, with purpose. "You ever wonder what comes after the sorrow?" she asked, not turning toward him. "Used to," he said. "Now I just try to keep my feet under me and my hands busy." She set a bowl in front of him. "I thought the same. That maybe the work would keep the sorrow from swallowing me." He tasted the stew, simple and warm with wild onion and dried meat. "It helps." She sat across from him. "There's a thing folks used to say back in Gallatin. That I was broken beyond repair." Cooper met her eyes. "They were wrong. They said it to my face. I'm not them." She didn't look away. "You're the first man who hasn't looked at me like I'm a burden. I see a woman who's still standing." Her voice dropped. "How do you know I won't fall again?" He reached across the table, not touching her, but close enough for her to feel the heat of his hand. "Because I've seen how you get back up." She didn't answer, but something shifted behind her eyes, something unguarded, something that had been locked away too long. Later, when Walker napped and the wind turned soft through the grass, Nella stepped outside and sat beside Cooper on the porch. She didn't say anything, and neither did he. But after a while, she let her shoulder rest lightly against his, and he didn't move away. The sun dipped low, and the land turned gold and quiet. And for the first time in a long while, Nella didn't feel like she was waiting for something to go wrong. She felt, instead, like something right might be starting. The first snow came early that year, soft and dry, dusting the porch rail before the sun had fully risen. Nella stood at the window, the hem of Cooper's spare coat brushing her calves, watching the flakes drift past the glass with quiet concentration. Behind her, Walker breathed evenly beneath the quilt, curled toward the wall as he always did now. Cooper stepped in from the shed, shaking frost from his hat. "Ground'll freeze by nightfall." She nodded but didn't turn. "It's quiet the way snow makes everything hush." He hung his coat near the stove. "You ever seen it come this soon?" "No, not in Gallatin." She hesitated. "First year after my marriage, we didn't get snow till December. I remember because I'd just sewn curtains, and I wanted to see them in winter light." "Did you like it there?" She pulled her shawl tighter. "I like parts. I liked the creek that ran behind the house. And there was a boy who sold apples from a cart every Thursday. He always saved the green ones for me. Said they were sweeter." Cooper leaned against the wall. "Funny what stays in your memory." She glanced at him. "What do you remember?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "A dog I had as a boy. Brown mutt. Wouldn't leave my side. When my daughter got sick, he wouldn't leave her cot, either. Stayed until the end. After that, he wouldn't eat. Just laid under the porch till he went." Nella held his gaze for a breath, then looked away. "You loved her deeply, didn't you?" He nodded once. "Still do, in a way." She crossed her arms. "I didn't think I'd ever feel anything again. Not real feeling. But lately, I feel like I'm waking up. Slow but sure." He stepped closer. "Don't rush it. Healing ain't a race." She looked up at him, eyes steady. "You said once I was just getting started." "I meant it." "So did I," she said. Later that day, Cooper hitched Flint to the sled and made for the mill with a list in his coat pocket. Nella stayed behind, gathering kindling with Walker bundled beside her, his mittens stitched from scraps she'd found in the bottom of a cedar chest. He didn't speak yet, not often, but he hummed again, and sometimes he reached for her hand without prompting. By late afternoon, she had a pot of potatoes and dried meat simmering when Cooper came through the door, his arms full of flour, salt, and a roll of canvas. I figured we could fix the roof seam before the next storm, he said, setting the supplies down. She glanced at the bundle. You mean I should climb up there with a hammer? You strike me as someone who could. I probably could, she said, and for the first time, her smile wasn't careful. It was real. That evening, after Walker had fallen asleep beside the fire, Nella sat on the floor near the hearth, her knees drawn up, her fingers twisting a length of thread. I got a letter once, she said, from my sister. After the fire, she said I should come east, live with her and her husband. They had a room, she said, and no children of their own. Cooper stirred the coals with the poker. Why didn't you go? Because she called me a ghost in the letter. She said, I know you're not yourself, as if I'd vanished. I didn't want to live in a place where I'd have to prove I was still here. You shouldn't have to, he said. She looked across the room at him. Do I seem like myself now? He set the poker down. I don't know who you were before, but who you are now. She's strong. She sees things clear. She doesn't give up. I'm afraid to hope, she said, voice low. He moved closer, crouching beside her. Then let me hope for the both of us. She looked down at her hands, then back at his face. I need to know this isn't pity. It's not. You're sure? I don't pity you, Nella. I admire you. He paused. You make me feel like I could begin again, too. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them slowly and reached for his hand. Then let's begin. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the hills in silence. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, and the space between them narrowed, no longer hollow but warm and certain. And in that stillness, something steady took root, something that wouldn't vanish with the cold. The roof was mended by midwinter. Cooper watched from the ladder as Nella stitched the canvas tight along the seam, her movements careful, her jaw set against the wind. She'd taken to wearing one of his old wool shirts beneath her dress, the sleeves rolled high as she worked. He passed her a nail, and her fingers brushed his just long enough to hold a charge. Inside, the cabin had changed. Not in size, but in shape of sound, of rhythm. The cradle now held a quilt Nella had pieced together from scraps of worn cotton. A shelf had been cleared for dried herbs she gathered with Walker near the creek, and the table held a row of clay jars she bartered for at the Grange. There was no talk anymore of leaving. One morning, while Cooper fed the hens, Nella stepped outside with a parcel wrapped in muslin. She handed it to him without a word. He opened it slow, revealing a shirt she had sewn by hand dark blue, with brass buttons polished to a soft gleam. The stitching was neat, reinforced at the shoulders. I thought if you were going to keep doing all this for us, she said, brushing her palms against her skirt, you ought to have something made for you. Cooper's voice was quiet. No one's made me a thing since my girl was born. She looked down. I don't sew for just anyone. He reached out and cupped her wrist, thumb grazing her pulse. I know that. Spring crept in across the land in slow, wet steps. The snow melted in patches, revealing earth rich and ready. They planted together beans, turnips, a row of carrots that Nella marked with small stones. Walker knelt beside her, his hands dusty, his brow furrowed with concentration. It was Cooper who noticed it first. Nella looked up from the garden bed where she knelt, brushing soil from her palms. He's humming again. No, Cooper said, kneeling beside her. He's talking. They turned toward Walker, who was whispering something to the carrots. Nella crouched near him, heart caught in her throat. What did you say, sweetheart? Walker looked up, eyes wide but clear. I said grow, please. Nella folded over him without a word, gathering him in her arms, her face buried in his hair. Later that night, after Walker had drifted to sleep in the cradle he'd outgrown, but still returned to when the wind howled, Nella poured water into the basin, while Cooper shaved by lantern light. You still think you're a man made for solitude? She asked, wringing out the cloth. He rinsed the blade. I don't think that anymore. She turned, leaning against the table. I don't either. He dried his hands and looked at her. I've been wondering how long we'd keep dancing around this. She didn't smile. And I want you beside me. Not as a guest. Not for a season. I want to wake up and see you in this room. Every day. Nella's breath caught, but she didn't look away. You mean it? I've meant it every day since I found you on that hill. She crossed the room and took his face in her hands. Then you should ask me proper. He kissed her first slow and certain, the way a man does when he's waited long enough to be sure. When he pulled back, She was crying, and he traced her cheek with his thumb, careful as ever. He asked her then, in the stillness of that room, if she would marry him. She said yes. The wedding was small. A preacher from Red Lodge came by wagon, and the ceremony was held beneath the cottonwood where Walker first spoke again. Nella wore a cream-colored dress that Cooper hadn't seen until that morning, and when she stepped outside, he forgot how to breathe. Walker stood between them, holding both their hands. When the vows were said, and the preacher gave his blessing, Nella bent low and kissed her son's temple before turning to Cooper. That night, they sat on the porch, the stars low and wide above. Nella leaned her head against Cooper's shoulder, her fingers twined with his. "I didn't know life could feel like this," she said. He kissed her hair. "You feel like home to me." Years later, the cabin still stood, stronger now with a second room added and a garden that stretched along the hill. Nella's mending was known from Red Lodge to Bridger, and Cooper kept a team of horses for trade. Walker grew tall, sharp-eyed like his mother, and gentle-handed like the man who raised him. In the evenings, Nella sat in the rocker by the hearth, a child's shirt in her lap, and Cooper's hand resting on her knee. The fire cracked. The wind passed by, and nothing pressed in. They had endured. They had found each other, and they were happy, fully, completely, and without end.